This conversation was originally live recorded at Startup Days 2024 in Bern.
AVA, as anyone I think can attest that has ever worked with me, was way more than a startup for me. It really was, it was kind of my values poured into a company. And so it was very, very difficult. There was a lot of guilt, there was a lot of shame. And obviously we had a team that I loved that was suddenly losing their jobs.
Welcome to the Swisspreneur Show, a podcast about startup stories and learnings from experienced entrepreneurs. If you enjoy listening to our show, make sure to follow the podcast and leave a rating. And now, here's your host, Sylvan.
Hello everyone, good afternoon. Thank you all for joining. I'm almost fully booked. We have a very exciting guest, also a very well-known face of the Swiss startup ecosystem here. Lea, a very well welcome and thank you for taking the time.
Sure, thank you so much for having me.
Most people probably know you as co-founder and former CEO of AVA, a FemTech startup focusing on fertility tracking.
Yeah.
But today you're also the founder and CEO at expeerly, where you basically help companies and users to generate reviews for product services in a video format.
Exactly.
We're going to talk about both stories. I actually just want to, start here. It has been a while since you were on the podcast the last time. How have you been after all these years?
Yeah, it's great that you're asking me. I actually looked it up. We did the last podcast in 2017, which is a very long time ago. It feels like 3 lifetimes ago. I've been good. When we last spoke, Pascal, who's here in the audience, was still CEO. I ran marketing sales out of San Francisco and then came back, took Pascal's job, moved to Switzerland, had 2 kids, and now we're here.
And if you ran into Lea in 2017, the Lea from then, what advice would you give to her?
I don't really believe in this giving advice to your former self thing, because then you kind of, try to make things different, which I wouldn't want to. I think everything happened the way that it kind of was probably supposed to happen.
No. AVA, we have known the story. You grew rapidly, you went international. I want to go back to 2021. You were about to raise your Series C funding. You were in touch with different investors. And I want to hear your very personal view on things. What was the feedback from investors back then in 2021 when you started raising your Series C?
Yeah, I'm happy to share that. I think one thing that I want to say before, though, is that it's 2 years ago, and we all have selective memory. And secondly, I think there were so many stakeholders at the end of AVA somewhat involved. And I think all of us probably had a very different perspective on things. So happy to share, but also know that lots of people probably have different opinions about the AVA story. But 2021, we were raising the Series C. So we were planning to raise a 50 million growth round. And your question, how was the feedback from investors? I think always when you go into fundraising, there's good things and there's bad things. Like we went into it and we knew we had a couple of things that were really great and we had other things that weren't so great, and then you try to make a pitch around the great things. But overall, we had a lead investor that we got a commitment for, I think, end of 2021, beginning of 2022, that would have led the round, yeah.
Of course, as a founder, you also always have to work on a plan B if things with the lead investor that looks promising doesn't work out. What was your plan B back then?
Yeah, I don't know if any founder needs a plan B, but can recommend. So at that time, we did the shift with AVA from a B2C company to a B2B company. So we had distribution partners, and in that moment, we were also trying to close, or actually we were in the process of closing a US distribution partner, which would have given us also cash inflow. I think that's important because we're going to come back to this. So there would have been an upfront payment from the US distributor as well.
So basically you needed money to survive, to grow further.
Like everyone, yeah.
Exactly. You put up the options with the distributor and the potential lead investor.
Yeah.
So things seem to look pretty good.
Yeah, at the beginning of I'm always mixing up those dates. 2022, is that correct? Yeah, we were on track to close the distribution round and the fundraising. It was obviously stressful, as everyone can attest to that has ever done fundraising, but I think at that point we were really optimistic about it, yeah.
But then things did not fully go as planned. What happened?
Yeah, no, they didn't. So we had think, and again, those dates, I think probably in around March or so. So we went through due diligence with the investor, and then I think we heard in March after, so we signed the term sheet, we had all the contracts ready, we spent gazillions on lawyers, as you can imagine. And I think in March, or end of March, they got back to us and said that they would decline the investment. Which, I think in startup world, you hear about term sheets that in the end are pulled back. It's not common, but it happens. And so that happened to us. And then we were actually really confident that we were going to close it. So I actually had a trip to Thailand planned with my family for the first time. And I was like, yay, we're going to celebrate that we have money. Then that didn't happen because the investor pulled out. And then the first night that I was in Thailand, the US distributor also pulled out. So we had multiple layers of things that didn't go well. And that pretty much brought us to the place where we were then. I was in Bangkok, and we recognized for the first time that we were really in a cash situation that wasn't sustainable anymore for the company.
What were the reasons that they both pulled out?
That's one of the things where I think everyone would give you a different answer. So I don't want to answer it because I truly don't know. I think everyone probably has. We have to say, timing-wise, that was at the beginning, the Ukraine war just started, I think. So there were a couple of things. There was an announcement from Apple that kind of went into our space, which in the end didn't happen, but the announcement was there. There were definitely in the negotiations on the contract, there were a couple of things that popped out that weren't ideal. So it's tough to say. And then the US thing, we don't know. That was the shortest call in history. So I was on the phone with that person, and he was like, the board decided against it. And I think I managed to say okay, and then we hung up. So I have no idea what came out of that.
Wow. Plan A and Plan B both gone, vanished at the same time almost. I assume your vacation turned a bit differently. What did you do as a founder?
I mean, my husband's here in the audience, so he can attest to that. Look, I mean, we had to find a solution really fast at that point. So I was obviously in touch with our board, and together with the board, we knew we had to give the investors a plan ASAP. And there were obviously, most of you know, there's different things that are in the room at that point, right? Do your investors bridge you? That's one of the questions. Can you sell the company? How fast can you fundraise? We knew we didn't have enough cash to go into another fundraise. And I think that's also a thing just to share with all the founders, right? The problem is if you go into a fundraise and then at the last moment the whole thing drops, for months you didn't build up other sources, right? Because during that period you're on an exclusivity period. So you have to completely restart the fundraise, which at a Series C level takes 6 to 12 months. So we knew that we didn't have time to do that. We weren't at that point sure what the investors, whether the investors would support it. So with the board, basically, we elaborated all the different plans that we had, and one of the potential plans was to sell the company. So I spent most of my Thailand vacation on the phone till 3 a.m. in the morning, trying to find potential buyers for AVA.
And where did you find them? Did you just cold call them?
Hey, partly, yeah, you're all laughing. No, I think one of the things that we did really well from the beginning on, and that was really kind of Pascal who started that, was we always knew our competitors, we always knew our suppliers, we knew the other companies that were in the space. So it wasn't, I put together a list of, I don't know what it was, probably 15 companies, and I called them all up. And I knew the CEOs of all of these companies. And they all took our call. The interest was actually quite good at that point.
What was the storyline there? Because you sort of had back to the wall by both options A and B falling through, liquidity running out. What was sort of the storyline that you used in that call?
I mean, I was quite honest. I was quite honest. I just said we're exploring a sale. It's one of the options that we have right now. So that was the storyline. And
what was the reaction?
I mean, people were surprised, but they also weren't that surprised because during that time, the fundraising environment had already shifted quite a bit. And so, I mean, it depends. I think we walked out in the end with 2 quite solid offers and a couple of less solid offers. But there definitely was interest. There was also interest in just the team. So those are the less solid options, would have been just kind of an acqui-hire. But the more solid options were also on the table.
And probably also the technology that you developed was also of interest, I imagine.
Technology, IP. So there were a lot of things. I mean, at that point, the company again, you could debate on a lot of things, but it was there was a lot of solidity to the company at that point.
And to pull that off, with your back to the wall, that's already quite an achievement to have multiple options in such a short time. How do you then evaluate them against each other to find the right decision for you, your investors, and also yourself ultimately?
Yeah, I mean, I think at that point you have to be really realistic. The guiding principle is return of investment for your investors, and rightfully so. So while we cared about a couple of other things, the calculation in the end was which of these scenarios offers the best return on investment for our investors. I mean, AVA had at that point raised quite a bit of money, so we needed to make sure to put our investors in a good spot.
And in that regard, I'm not sure how open you can talk about it, but what did that mean in terms of return on investment?
Yeah, I mean, so really, it is a very good question, and I would answer it if I could, but not because I can't, in a sense of I'm not allowed to, but more in a sense of the two options that we had on the table, where in the end we went for one of those, were share deals, right? So we basically exchanged our shares versus the shares to someone else, which then on any kind of Excel sheet you all know how Excel sheets work. Things can look very differently depending on how you look at it. So we obviously had to estimate the valuation of the company in the future, and then debate how much our shares would be worth. And there were milestones, and so it was a rather complex beast in the end.
And you did decide to sell to FemTech in 2022 then.
Yeah.
What made you go for that option despite the pure return on investment or potential return?
I really believed in the main thesis that FemTech offered. So you have to imagine the women's health space at that point, and honestly that's still the case, was and is very, very fragmented. So there were multiple companies in the space that all kind of covered a tiny little slice of the whole pie, which made it really hard for all of us because we all tried to move into B2B. And what we saw is that, and when I say B2B, it's mostly the employer and insurance market in the US. And what we saw was that these employers and insurers had a hard time differentiating all of us. Even though we all offered something different, for them it was a kind of like a check mark. Do something for your female employees, check, right? So we would compete with companies that we really shouldn't have been in competition with them. So what FemTech tried to do, which I still believe was and is the right thing to do, is they tried to bring companies together and to actually form one large women's health company that could then jointly go to employers and sell multiple services. So that's I think what really convinced me, our investors, our board, because we all really believed in that thesis. And in that whole momentum, FemTech also acquired multiple other companies. So they acquired Birchbox, which might be a company that some of you are aware of, and they also acquired a couple of other companies to then really form this conglomerate that would cover women's health more broadly.
I see. It sounds like a very compelling vision to work towards.
Yeah.
You then made that deal, the share deal, and at the same time, that's also very difficult, right? You on paper see, okay, this can be a very good deal, but it could also be a pretty bad deal. You just don't know at that very exact moment when you close.
Yeah.
How do you communicate that to your team, but also to the media in terms of, hey, we sold, should we celebrate or should we be sad?
Yeah, that was a really tough one, and I'm glad you're asking that question because I think we got quite a bit of feedback on that after the transaction went through, because of how difficult it was to announce that. It was obviously a sell that we didn't really want to do at that point, but then it was still a good sale potentially while we did it. Plus also, so we were actually really optimistic about it, and we also wanted to make sure that the team was really optimistic about it too, right? Yeah. So we basically decided to go out with a very optimistic, kind of realistic, but still very leaning optimistic message and say, hey, look, we sold, here's what that will offer us in the future. But obviously you could have read that very differently and said, wait, your funding round collapsed and you had to sell. Why do you give out a positive message? So I think that was a tricky situation to communicate correctly.
Would you do anything differently with that learning now in the bucket?
No. I honestly, even 2 years later, I don't know how you could do that.
It's super hard.
I think we chose the right track.
And then a bit after the acquisition closed, FemTech, the acquiring company, actually got into trouble themselves.
Yeah.
They stopped paying vendors, they stopped paying salaries, etc. What did that mean for you personally? How did that affect you?
I mean, that's a broad question. Yeah, I mean, obviously, like a lot of things happened that went against the promises that we got from FemTech very quickly, which again is also a learning. I think a lot of seasoned founders laugh about that because they, like, I think it's kind of an open secret that after you sell your company, things will come different than what you heard before. But obviously, I went through this the first time, so I was, I think, blissfully naive in that sense a little bit. You know, it was a tough environment. They had SPAC money. You all remember SPACs. They were a thing. Or they thought they would have SPAC money, and then they didn't. We had to then let go people, which really wasn't part of the deal at all. And within that first kind of layoff round, I also left the company. And to your question, how did that affect me? I mean, the layoff itself, that wasn't a huge deal for me. But I think, you know, AVA, as anyone I think can attest that has ever worked with me, was way more than a startup for me. It really was, I don't know, it was kind of my values poured into a company. And so it was very, very difficult. There was a lot of guilt, there was a lot of shame. And obviously we had a team that I loved that was suddenly losing their jobs. We had investors that I really liked that lost their money. So a lot of things happened that weren't great at that point.
And I imagine, like, I can only think about it, but you going through that, you went from the first crisis that hit you with losing the financing round, then losing the distributor, and then you think, okay, we finally found the deal and sort of a bit of a break to breathe again, and then you just go into the next crisis, basically.
Startup life, yeah.
But that's brutal, no? Like, completely brutal.
I mean, you know, it took me 2 years to talk about this. You know, it was hard. It was hard. But also at the same time, during that time, I think, the board was extremely supportive that we had at that point. My former co-founders were very supportive. And you just function. I think every CEO knows in crisis situations, you just function. I don't think you turn your head much left and right. You just work at that point.
And then sort of the ultimate breakup with you leaving the company as well. That's also probably a big process to come to that decision and say, hey,
went very
it's not.
Quick.
Yeah? Surprisingly.
That one went very quick.
Why was it so quick? Because I would imagine that to take a very big step to also emotionally let go of the company.
No, because I already had to emotionally let go of the company. I think as soon as you see your baby being treated in a different way that you would treat your baby, you leave. So that was an easy decision. Yeah.
And then there were also outstanding salary payments, right?
Yeah. Made it into the press. So multiple employees of ours, plus including me, weren't paid anymore at the end. Yeah.
And we did a bit of digging. So you mentioned they acquired 4 or 5 other companies. At the same time, 3 of them sued them later for false promises. And we also saw that there seemed to be some paper trails leading back to selling companies for $1 and then basically acquiring the same team that they just let go of before, again, to continue working on the same idea with the same, you know, IP, etc.
Yeah.
And I wonder, why would anyone go through all of that trouble if it wasn't for taking out the IP, getting rid of everyone who invested and contributed to that, to then just rebuild it with full upside? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I obviously have many thoughts on that, but I obviously also cannot comment on any of that. Can't comment on any of that. I mean, I can only give you a personal answer. My personal answer is AVA is back on the shelf now. You can buy the AVA product if you're in the US. And even though the company went bankrupt. And, you know, in a way, for me now, personally, I'm actually really glad that that's the case. I think it would have been worse to see the whole thing disappear. I'm actually quite glad that people are using it.
That's on a personal mission level to see, hey, what you built with your amazing team over the years is back. But at the same time, it also seems like this is potentially a fraud case. Again,
I cannot comment on that either. But do more of your digging and find out.
I think it's just very interesting because as soon as you see IP startups, there is something very valuable. And there's also an incentive to get that out and start from scratch without the past. So I'm curious to see how that will turn out.
Yeah.
you left AVA, and of course, today we also want to talk about your new venture and bootstrapping versus VC money, because
which is officially our topic, everyone.
Exactly. So first of all, what did you do after you left AVA? Did you take a break? Did you recover? What did you do after leaving your company that you built over the years?
Oh my God, this is going to sound so new age spiritual, but I went on a vision quest in the US.
Okay.
Where I didn't eat for 3 days and slept in a tent and talked to a tree. So typically not the kind of person to do that, but I did that. Yeah, it was great. Can recommend if anyone.
What happened there? What did you find on that trip?
The tree did not talk back to me.
Surprising.
Trees don't. I went back and I was like, oh my God, I'm going to do this all the time now. And obviously I never did that again. But it was great because it gave me time to think about what I wanted to do next, which bootstrapping, by the way, was a big part of. Yeah.
And then, you started your new venture, expeerly.
Yeah.
And we talked briefly about where you basically are a third-party review service. Independent customers review services or products with the video format.
Yeah.
That's quite a leap from FemTech. What led you to that new space?
Yeah. So just because it's a hard one to explain, I'll just quickly explain how that actually looks like. So imagine you're Dyson and you have a new product out. You will want to bring that into the hands of people before you actually start selling it, because you will want content on that. So what we do is we take products like that, we distribute it across end customers. They film their experience, they review it, and then we not only create those reviews, we also distribute them across the internet. So we have retail partner like Galaxus and Brock that will then show those reviews, and then we have other partners where we distribute them. So that's kind of how the system works. So is it far away from the FemTech world? Yes, it is far away from the FemTech world. But there is a very clear link, which is that it's really about authentic storytelling. And it's about authentic storytelling, and it's about making sure that you can showcase products in a meaningful and actually interesting way. And a lot of that came from my time at AVA. During the time when I led marketing and sales, we worked with authentic user stories over and over and over again, because we realized that that is what works. People wanted to see actually women getting pregnant with this. So that's what we are now offering to other companies. And I think the second link was we were so annoyed about the review space when we were at AVA. The amount of money we spent on Trustpilot and all the other companies was intense. And so we're also replacing that to a certain extent.
And what was sort of the thing that, then pushed you in that direction? Hey, I want to start a company here. Was it that trip that laid the groundwork in the US?
I kind of really just wanted to try it out. I think after AVA had so much freedom suddenly. So I didn't know if it would become a company or if it would become big or small, but I had the option to try out whether it could be a company. And I was lucky enough to have a couple of people who believed in it really early on. So I was able to do pilots, get the whole thing profitable and bootstrapped, and off the ground. Yeah.
How did you validate the whole thing to say, there's something and I want to fully dedicate my time on this?
It's a really good question. I don't believe in product market fit. This is a side discussion. I think product market fit is something that you have to get to again and again and again and again and again, because AVA had product market fit 17 times, but then the 18th time was hard. So I think it was enough. Like for me, there were a couple of things. Like, is it enough that I can live of it? Is it enough that someone else can live of it? And now we're a small team and everyone can live of it. So that's how that's the proof that I needed. That I can pay salaries.
Exactly.
That's a really good proof to have.
Absolutely. Yeah. And how do you actually make money? What is your business model with this setup?
So we sell to companies the fact that they can get their products or services reviewed, and then we also participate in the distribution. So every time, and I urge you all to do this, when you go to Galaxus and you see a video review, please click on it, because then we actually make a little bit of money.
So they pay you for the volumes that your videos get consumed, basically.
Yeah,
okay.
Exactly. Yeah.
Is there any other revenue stream, or is that the main driver?
That's the main driver.
Okay. And one thing is also interesting. You started the company, right? But recently you announced that you also found your late co-founders.
Yeah.
And I just wonder, how do you do that, to find co-founders when you already started working on an idea, and then bring them in a bootstrap company where you probably also really need to align on, hey, we want to stay bootstrap, we have the same understanding and the same vision. How do you find the late co-founders to bring them on board after you already started?
Yeah, I think we did a couple of things differently than others would. Again, coming back to what I said before, when I started expeerly, I wanted to have the ultimate freedom. So co-founders weren't in the picture. I wouldn't have added co-founders. And Philip joined expeerly, and I said, "You're never going to be a co-founder. I'm never going to do this." And he was like, "Sure, we'll see." And he's been working with me for a year until I came back, and I was like, "Okay, never mind. You'll be co-founder." So I had a de facto co-founder with Philip very, very early on, and then we added Ollie now. And I think that it all kind of made sense, because when you build a bootstrap company, for all those that haven't, one way of doing this is that you kind of become a service company before you become a product company. So you sell services to be profitable, and during that profitability, you start building up your actual product. And so I think we've reached a point at the end of last year where we saw, okay, the product will actually work. So before it was more of a service thing, now it's actually a product thing, so it also made sense to make that shift.
What was the service that you offered before?
We just acted as an agency, so whoever needed user-generated content could come to us, and we would do that for them.
Nice.
Yeah.
And by bringing on these two late co-founders, one with like 1 year of previous work history, how do you split the shares? Is there any difference, or do you say, no, we're all co-founders, you split them the same way?
You mean difference versus if I had added them at the very beginning?
Right.
I guess so. Yeah, I guess so. I don't know. I mean, share distributions are always kind of a mystery thingy. So I don't know if it would have been different, but I guess a little bit, because I've worked for it for a while before.
Got it.
Yeah.
So now let's finally talk about bootstrapping versus VC funding. For you, freedom was really important. Was that the main driver where you said, hey, I want to be fully independent, I want to call the shots, I don't want to have any investors on board?
I think what I was kind of blind to before, because I was in San Francisco for so long, and at events like this one, is I think we very rarely talk about the bootstrapped companies. There's a lot of hype around the fundraised companies. I can attest to that because I did that. And that's great, because there's a lot of reasons for certain companies to be fundraised. But what I found when I came back to Switzerland is that there's actually a bunch of really interesting companies that went the bootstrapped way. Small PDF, to name one, Digital Republic, Tomodomo, my husband's company. Like there's a couple of people that I saw that actually were entrepreneurs, but they did it in a very different way. And I don't think I had enough role models before to see that, because again, the media tries to hype up venture companies so much more. And I realized that they actually, financially, it seemed almost more attractive to go the bootstrapped way if you manage to do it. And freedom-wise, it definitely makes more sense. So it's something that I wanted to try out.
Just like also a new learning curve for you personally.
It's a very different thing to do. Yeah.
Absolutely. So what would you say are the biggest pros of being bootstrapped?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it's partly the freedom. It's partly also that as a CEO, you don't fundraise all the time. Otherwise, as a CEO, you spend, I don't know, 70% of your time fundraising or investor relations, so you don't do that, which I think is really interesting. But I think the more important thing is the numbers game is different. So I think the chances of me selling my company now for $1 billion are pretty slim. But the chances of it just being attractive, financially, kind of on a base level attractive, are much higher than if you go the funded way, right? So it's less of an all or nothing game. And I didn't really want another all or nothing game. And I think that's a big advantage if you're kind of in a life stage where that's fine. Yeah.
And of course, there are also cons to that choice.
Yeah.
What are some of the cons that you see now experiencing both?
So I think certain ideas just can't be done without money. I think the real moonshot ideas, where the all or nothing game is what you want to go for, you can't do without money. Healthcare is a lovely example. It's just you need the funding to do that. I think that's one. And then the other one that I recognized a little later, it's quite interesting, is when you go the bootstrapped way, you also have to be willing to get your hands very dirty for a long time. If you're the CEO of a funded company, like very quickly the tasks that you do will shift to a very managerial thing, right? You hire your team, the investors, this, that, like you think about the best way to run an all hands. I don't even have an all hands. So which is great. I really like that, but I can see the appeal of going for kind of because the learning curve is so crazy. And obviously then you get all the all the media hype around you if you go the fundraised way. So I do see advantages of it. I don't think one of them is better than the other. I really think depending on the idea and depending on also where you are in life, one might make more sense than the other.
Right. Yeah. And you mentioned something before. We really like to celebrate these big funding rounds.
Yeah.
That's often just when the work starts, right? You close a big round, you celebrate, but then you actually have to deliver because you made a lot of promises to all the investors and you have to deliver a return. So I wonder from your founder perspective of running both bootstrapped and VC funded, both have their stressful moments in very different ways. Which one is more stressful for you?
It's a different kind of stress, I think. I would say, it's really a different kind of stress. But I think the fundraised way is in many ways more stressful because you are responsible for more people. There's less consistency. There's more craziness. Again, if you run your own company, it's your own money on the line, so that also doesn't feel great all the time. So they're both stressful in just a very different way. Right. Startups, yeah.
And you seem to have great investors on board at AVA, and at the same time, they also, pitch themselves, say, "Hey, we're smart money. We're really going to help you." Now, not having that support, do you feel there's something lacking? You feel like less of a support, or does that beyond the money not really matter that much?
At AVA, we had a very large group of very smart people as investors. But when you have a very large group of very smart people, the actual value goes down quite a bit because the managerial work to manage so many people makes it harder. So while everyone in there was clearly smart and accomplished, that might have been outweighed by the complexity that the whole thing brought. So no, right now I don't think I miss that much. Again, because the cost of it was also quite big.
I imagine if you would add all the recommendations and support you got, it can also add up to less than the total sum of it, because some say go left, some say go right, and then it's difficult for you. Like, where do you actually go as a founder with your company?
I mean, we could have a long conversation about that, which we won't right now, but clearly, I mean, we had investors that wanted extremely different things from the company, especially when you're in healthcare and you're global as we were, the opinions differed quite a bit.
So in that sense, it was also just, hey, I don't want that anymore. Let's go bootstrapped.
Again, it's the freedom path, right? Yeah, I mean, we might fundraise eventually, probably not, but maybe. Like, I'm not saying no one should do it, but I'm just saying it also comes at a cost.
And I also want to talk about the return profile. You mentioned the unicorn status, the billion-dollar exit, which is, of course, usually the goal with VC-backed startups. And at the same time, for you as a founder, it could actually be even much more attractive because you have more shares. And even if you sell much lower, in the end, as a sum, you will make potentially more money, even with a much smaller exit when you are bootstrapped.
Yeah, I think that's something that people don't really realize. That as a founder of an even very, very highly valued company, of the lick preferences and all of that, depending on what kind of cell you have, it might look very attractive to the outside, but even inside it might not be as attractive. But again, I mean, bootstrap companies might just go bankrupt, right? Like, both of these things can happen. But there's actually there's a book that I recently read by Rand Fishkin. He's the CEO. He used to be the founder of SEO Moz, and he talks about that calculation in a very nice way, and also kind of compares bootstrap companies versus fundraise companies, and actually does lay out that the financial returns are often better, but obviously never as extreme.
Right.
Yeah.
I think it's just good to shape this awareness that, hey, you don't have to sell for 1 billion to actually have a good outcome for you personally.
Or you could sell for 1 billion and make no money at all.
Exactly.
There's founders that did that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How was the financial results in the end for the sell now with AVA?
I mean, the company that we got shares in a company that then declared bankruptcy, so 0.
Yeah. How is that after all these years of work that you put in the company? I know you learned a lot, etc., but you basically walk away with 0 money from what you have built. I'm kind of not torn about. I have a lot of friends who made a lot of money with their companies, especially given that we were in San Francisco for a long time. And I'm not
I'm not so sure if it's always a great thing to suddenly sit there with a lot of money. So there I don't think I'm so sad about that.
That's a good perspective to have.
Yeah, yeah.
What is now your goal with expeerly? Do you plan to ever sell, or do you say, hey, we want to be profitable and just take the money and reinvest? What is your ambition there?
Yeah. I want to have a certain sense of security, but beyond that, I want to, how when you work on something, and I don't think that's exclusive to entrepreneurs, you have these moments when you just really enjoy what you're doing and you think it's great and you're learning and it's exciting. I want to maximize for those moments. And so I want to make sure that the journey this time, a lot of founders, a lot of times startups, I think, are so focused on the end result that you forget the journey, or you say the journey kind of sucks, but the end result is going to be great.
That's difficult.
And I'm trying to turn that around. Not always successfully, but that's what I'm trying to optimize for. And I don't know if that means ever selling the company or not, or handing it over to my children. I don't know. Probably not.
Yeah. Well, the beauty is you have all options open. You have the full freedom to decide what feels right.
Yeah.
There's also a third trend that I see coming up, and just interesting to get your perspective. Maybe that's the third company that you will do in the future, raising exactly one round, then becoming profitable and never raise again.
Yeah,
what do you think about that?
It's the new cool thing.
Exactly.
I actually think that makes a lot of sense. It's a different kind of investor, because it usually doesn't. That's not venture investors. That's usually business angels or family offices, and I do think that makes a lot of sense. So again, sorry for mentioning this person the second time, but Rand Fishkin with his new company has a term sheet out that is public, that you can download, that did exactly that. And actually they structured it in a way that they raised one round, but they're paying it back. So that actually they are going to lose the outside investors eventually with time.
Cool.
So that's a free downloadable thing. And I think it's a very interesting one. Again, with expeerly, I wouldn't have even wanted to raise one round, but if you have to for a certain idea, I think that makes quite a bit of sense.
Depending on the business case, it seems like the best combination of both worlds.
Yeah, I think so.
So if you look back at everything that we just discussed, is it true that what doesn't kill you actually makes you stronger?
Great song. I do think that is true. But if I can take the opportunity, I do think it's true, but I don't necessarily think it's true for the startup ecosystem in Switzerland. Like I would have wished, I would wish that is also true for the ecosystem. And what I mean with that is that, what I recognized after AVA is that telling the story, I think, is really, really beneficial to a lot of founders. Because most founders are terribly afraid of exactly the outcome that I had. So it's good to be kind of a worst case scenario. And I think a lot of times founders are very afraid during the process that this might happen, and they're very alone. And I think telling this story helps. And what it made me realize is that we don't really talk about failure at all in this ecosystem. And it's hard. Again, it took me 2 years to, and you know how many times I told you I'm not going to do this. So it's very hard to do it because it's a very tainted thing. But I think it's so important for us as an ecosystem to also talk about these stories. Because I think as a founder, when you're in the trenches and you're in the middle of this and you're worried that this might happen to you, it's so important to know that A, you're not alone, and B, it's part of the game. The fundraise game statistically works like this. But we focus so hard on the 1%, 5%, 10% that really make it, that we leave everything else out. And I do hope that, I hope by sharing my story, other people will too, because I think it will make the startup ecosystem better.
Absolutely. And I would even go one step further. It's not only that we not talk about it, but often even have a negative reaction to someone going through exactly what you just described. And that's just not okay.
I have no idea how I would have dealt with it a couple of years ago, so I'm not going to blame anyone for it. But I do think, especially now, we know that a lot of companies are in trouble. There's the fundraising environment still hasn't gotten better. So there's a lot of people that go through this in maybe a less publicized way. And I think it's important to say that everyone that raises a lot of money signs up for something where the odds are clearly stacked against you. And if you're going to do great, then that's wonderful. But if you're not, then it was still worth giving it a shot. And I think that's kind of the message that we should have in the ecosystem versus only do it if you're absolutely sure and you're absolutely going to succeed.
You can never be.
I know.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Lea, thank you so much for serving as a role model, for being open
Once
and
again.
sharing your story here with us today. I really appreciate your time and you being here. Thank you so much. A big round of applause.
Thank you so much.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, you can support us by rating our show on Apple Podcasts. This way, we can reach an ever-growing number of aspiring entrepreneurs.